What's up, guys? Mr. Martin here. We're going to go over quotation rules. There's a lot of them, but they're pretty simple in my opinion. So let's get started. Direct quotes. So use quote marks to enclose a direct quotation, a person's exact words. Remember, exact words. That's the important part here. A direct quote generally begins with a capital letter. So here's an example. Explaining the lever, Archimedes said, "Give me a place to stand, and I can move the world." First of all, there's an error here. Get rid of that. So it's pretty much how this worked is the dialogue portion of this, kind of like giving context to what the sentence is, says, explaining the lever, Archimedes said. What did Archimedes say exactly? Archimedes exactly said, "Give me a place to stand, and I can move the world." You would not use quotations here if you were paraphrasing what he said. Like, for example, if I wrote Archimedes said something about standing and moving the world, that would not require direct quotation because that was not directly what Archimedes said. Interrupting expressions. So, this is another way to use quotations. When an interrupting expression divides a quoted sentence into two parts, the second part begins with a lowercase letter. I wish, comma, she said, that we went to the same school. So here's the first part of the dialogue. I wish. Then you use comma. And then who's saying this? She said, comma, that we went to the same school. The next part of the quotation is lowercase. And then you head it off just like basically a direct quote where you just write the rest of the dialogue. I know, comma, quote, I answered, comma, quote, but at least we are friends. What's important to remember here, the part that I feel is the trickiest part, whenever you're kind of doing this, is you always, if it's not the end of the quote, you put a comma where the period would be, generally speaking. Then you enclose it, use lowercase to specify, kind of like the she said or I answered, the interrupted expression. And you always put a comma at the end of the interrupted expression, quote, and then you always start the next part of the quote with lowercase. It's pretty tricky at first to get down. It's a little pattern you got to get used to, but once you get in the flow of it, it becomes second nature. Setting off direct quotes. So, a direct quotation can be set off from the rest of the sentence by a comma, a question mark, or an exclamation point, but not by a period. Dolores explained, comma, "You know how much I like chicken," as she passed her plate for more. So, here's the part of the little portion to give context to who's saying the quote, kind of how they're saying the quote. Dolores explained, and you basically transition into the quote, comma, as she passed her plate for more chicken. Or for more. See right here, the comma right here, kind of like it, basically the direct quotation acts as kind of like a bridge to the next portion that says, that gives more context to how the dialogue is being spoken. The advantage to kind of using to set off direct quotes like this is it gives more liveliness to the text. Let me give you an example here. I could change this dialogue right here to, "You know how much I like chicken," explained Dolores. However, that just kind of doesn't really set the how the dialogue's being pushed, how it's kind of coming across. But if I wrote Dolores explained, "You know how much I like chicken," as she passed her plate for more, that just gives it that extra little bit of liveliness and that little bit of flow that helps you kind of visualize. So here's the next part. "When will we be leaving?" asked Tony. So, important thing to note here. There's not a comma. There's a question mark. That's just kind of like a little rule here that you got to kind of remember, is that whenever you're dealing with quotes, the commas and the question marks and the exclamation marks all work the same way, except the question marks and the exclamation marks kind of denotes a different kind of basically way of speaking, as you should know. However, the commas, imagine the comma acting kind of in a way just like a period within this kind of context. Essentially, what's really kind of going on here is these kind of none of these necessarily just absolutely end like the kind of like the sentence in the entirety. They kind of just flow all together to make an entire concept. Like here, for example, the plumber shouted, "Turn off that faucet," when the water started gushing out of the pipe. See, like the sentences above, it does not end the entire concept here at "turn off that faucet." It only basically creates like an entire mental image. For example, though, if we changed the plumber said, "Turn out that faucet," period, we would not be able to continue right here. That would be basically a violation of a grammar rule. All right, let's move on to the next part. So, other marks and quotes. When used with quotation marks, other marks for punctuation are placed according to the following rules. Semicolons and colons are placed outside the closing quotations. Well, this is when we start getting into a little bit of that complicated territory. You know, things are getting fancy whenever semicolons and colons are being talked about. It's just important to, you might not understand them yet, but just understand how it works in terms of quotations. So you basically place them outside of the closing quotation instead of placing them inside the closing quotation, as you can see right here. So you wouldn't put them right here, kind of like you would, whoops, you'd put them right there outside of that. So commas and periods are placed inside quotation marks and question marks. So right here you see this. I haven't seen the movie. You don't place it outside, like you don't do this. You put it inside, different than the rule above for semicolons and colons, remarked Jeanette. But I understand, it's excellent. You put the period right there. See, here's the thing. Kind of just hone in on this rule right here. This is what you'll be using most of the time. And all my time writing and stuff like that, seldom have I ever had to place a semicolon or a colon outside of the quotes. But once you encounter a situation where you're going to have to do it, just remember this is different. And then it'll kind of remind you that, hey, don't put them inside, put them outside. Exclamation points are placed inside the closing quotation marks if the quotation itself is a question or an explanation. Otherwise, they're placed outside. this is where things get it's a little bit tricky down here, I guess. So let's go through the example. Is it too cold in here? The manager asked as I shivered. Yes, I answered. Please turn on the air conditioner. Please turn down the air conditioner. So, can you please explain the saying, penny wise, pound foolish? So, here's where it gets a little bit complicated. You can see in these two, this is dialogue directly from a person asking a question. This is dialogue directly from a person exclaiming, yes. And this is also dialogue of saying somebody's telling somebody to turn down the air conditioner. However, this right here is not dialogue. It's the saying that somebody's asking to be defined. However, this dialogue does not denote a question. And this right here, it's not an insult to be called a bookworm, is essentially, this is not being exclaimed. The whole basically idea is being exclaimed. If you put it on the inside, you're implying that somebody is specifically shouting bookworm, which is not the case. Or you're specifically implying that this is an interrogative. This right here is an interrogative, which is not the case. Kind of think about quotes as like their own little self-contained like little world. And anything what's inside the quote kind of alters what's inside the quotes. So if I just moved the exclamation point from there into there, that would alter the meaning to something that is not going on. Which nobody's shouting bookworm. They're shouting the entire sentence. Or, if I move the question mark into here, can you please explain the saying, penny wise, pound foolish? This basically changes right here is not a question anymore, and right here is a question, which is simply not true from a semantic point of view. This entire idea is a question. All right, does that make sense? Yeah, just if you don't get it, just kind of go through it a few times. It'll make sense eventually. It took me like an entire year to understand these rules. It'll take you guys probably just one day because you guys are geniuses. Punctuating dialogue. When you write dialogue, being a new paragraph every time the speaker changes. What's that? Sally demanded impatiently. Lucy seems surprised. What's what? That thing. What you got in your hand. Oh, this. And she held it up for Sally to inspect. Error right here. So, right here, the dialogue. So, basically, this is an important one to remember. This is a mistake I see all the time. However, it's important to note here, important to note something, that this rule, the punctuating dialogue rule, is not always followed even in literature. For example, in the book The Metamorphosis, they bunch together, it's bunched together, all the author bunches together all the dialogue and doesn't change the paragraph for the characters who are speaking. And that leads to still a great read, but it leads to actually confusion when you're reading it because all the character dialogue's bunched together into one paragraph. However, this kind of rule came into place because of that idea. So essentially, let's say, okay, Sally's speaking right now, and then you switch to a new line when Lucy's speaking, and then this is Sally speaking. It does not have to say Sally speaking because it is understood that there's only two characters talking, and it switches to the next line. And then we kind of go here. So we go to Lucy. And so it's implied that Lucy is talking because Sally was talking in the last line and people's talk in turns 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. So it's just kind of important to separate your dialogue like that, because if you didn't separate your dialogue, let's see if we can bunch them all together. Let's bunch them all together and I'll show you what happens. So if we had it like this, "What's that?" Sally demanded impatiently. Lucy seemed surprised. "What's what?" "That thing. What you got in your hand." "Oh, this." And she held it up for Sally to inspect. Right here. You might be able to, you'll be able to make sense of it if you think through it. But it really doesn't show right here. Lucy seemed surprised. But then at the same time, "what's what" could be not Lucy speaking because there's no break right here to imply that these two right here go together. And then right here, that thing you got in your hand, and oh, this, like there's no breaks to change who's thinking and saying what. So just remember that whenever you're writing dialogue and quotes, always switch the paragraph for different characters. Additional dialogue rules. So here we're at the end. If one person's speech goes on for more than one paragraph, use quotation marks to open the dialogue at the beginning of each paragraph. However, do not use closing quotation marks until the end of the final paragraph that the character is speaking. So essentially, just basically, as the rule says, use quotation marks to open the dialogue, but do not close it until the final paragraph, as in multiple paragraphs. Do not close the dialogue until you get to the end of the character's, the last paragraph the character is speaking. This rule right here, it's called the additional dialogue rule for a reason. Seldom will that ever actually happen. Usually the character dialogue is chopped up with interrupting quotes, like interrupting kind of expressions throughout multiple different paragraphs. You're seldom going to have somebody just talking and talking and talking and talking and talking. That's just usually not how literature is nowadays. So that was a lot to swallow. But all in all, I think each individual rule taken by itself, if you think about it by itself, it's pretty simple, and you guys will get it. You'll become masterful writers of dialogue. So thank you for watching, and all y'all stay safe.